I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Tuesday, January 13th, is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs because Netflix just released Part 2 of Sean Combs' The Reckoning without warning. No trailer, no countdown, no press tour explaining what was coming. It simply appeared, quietly, almost as if it wasn't meant to be noticed at first. And that silence is the first red flag. Because when something this heavy moves without noise, it's usually not about entertainment. It's about timing. It's about who needs to see it and who was hoping it wouldn't arrive at all. This isn't a continuation meant to recap the past. It's an escalation designed to rearrange it. Back on December 2nd, when the original documentary dropped, the world believed it was watching the full story. 4 parts, carefully structured. A rise, an empire, allegations, and a moment that felt like collapse. The series, produced with involvement from 50 Cent's G-Unit Films, used interviews and footage filmed just days before Diddy's arrest. The reaction was immediate. Conversations changed tone. Statements slowed. Certain names stopped appearing altogether. But even then, something didn't sit right. Scenes ended too early. Questions were raised and never returned to. Names appeared briefly, then vanished without context. Moments that felt important were shown just long enough to register, then cut away. And 50 Cent never pretended otherwise. In interviews and casual remarks, he kept repeating the same idea. What people saw wasn't everything. It was what could be shown at the time. This new release doesn't explain that. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't introduce itself properly. It assumes you remember what was said before and, more importantly, what wasn't. There's no recap, no hand-holding, no attempt to catch up casual viewers. The story resumes as if the silence since December was intentional, as if the gap itself was part of the structure. And that alone tells you who this chapter is really for. This isn't aimed at people discovering the story for the first time. It's aimed at people who were there when certain moments happened and assumed time would do the rest. From the first minutes, the tone is different. Not louder, heavier. Instead of long explanations, it relies on placement. Video clips, call recordings, images, party footage, planning conversations, material that doesn't accuse, but refuses to stand alone. Moments are placed side by side and left there long enough for discomfort to settle in. Conversations that once felt harmless now carry weight. Clips that seemed isolated now feel connected, not because the documentary tells you they are, but because your memory starts filling in the gaps on its own. And the timing matters. This didn't drop during a quiet period. It arrived while legal appeals are still pending, while civil cases continue without noise, while people who once spoke confidently are choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. At this stage, silence isn't neutral. It becomes part of the evidence of how this story is being handled. One of the most noticeable shifts is where the camera chooses to linger. There's far less focus on public moments. No red carpets, no award shows, no rehearsed interviews everyone's already seen. Instead, attention drifts toward the in-between spaces, after parties, private conversations, moments just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kind of moments that don't usually make it into documentaries, not because they're explosive, but because they're revealing when placed in the wrong order. And order is everything here. The same faces appear in the same rooms across different years. The same tone shows up in completely different situations. The same confidence remains even as circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental. Repetition is how patterns begin to form. What's especially unsettling is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown where people were, who else was present, and how often these configurations repeat. No conclusions are drawn on screen. But once events are stacked together instead of spaced years apart, the gaps disappear. And without gaps, forgetting becomes difficult. There's also an emotional shift compared to the earlier release. The first documentary carried a sense of revelation. This one carries consequence. The energy feels colder, more restrained, almost resigned, as if the story has moved past outrage and entered a phase where reality settles in quietly. That's when reputations stop reacting and start hardening, because outrage burns fast. Records don't. Before going to deeper of this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe our channels, and hit the bell icon. That's why never miss any update like this. Now let's back to the story. What this release understands is that power isn't challenged by shouting. It's challenged by context. This isn't loud. It's patient. It lets moments sit long enough for memory to catch up. And memory, once activated, doesn't reset when the screen goes dark. The documentary doesn't say, "Here's what happened." It asks, "Why was this never addressed?" And once that question is asked, it doesn't go away. This isn't about new shock value. It's about rearranging what people thought they already understood. And once those pieces move, they don't move back. What happens next isn't about adding new noise. It's about revisiting what was already shown and realizing how much of it was left unresolved. Back in December, when Sean Combs' The Reckoning first landed on Netflix, it felt definitive. 4 episodes, a clear structure, a rise, an empire, allegations, and the moment everything seemed to fracture. The series walked viewers through Diddy's public journey, the influence he built, and the investigation closing in around him. Footage filmed days before his arrest gave it immediacy. Interviews gave it authority. For most people, that felt like the full picture. But even then, there were signs that the story wasn't finished. Certain moments were introduced and then quietly abandoned. Questions were raised, acknowledged, and never returned to. Names surfaced briefly, then disappeared without explanation. Scenes cut away just as they started to feel uncomfortable. At the time, those gaps were easy to overlook. Documentaries do that. They condense, they prioritize, they move on. But what Part 2 does is force you to sit with those gaps. It doesn't rush past them. It brings them back into focus. You start noticing how often the original series relied on implication instead of completion. How frequently a moment would be presented, reacted to, and then left hanging. Not resolved, just paused. The assumption was that time would do the rest, that attention would move on, that the audience would fill in the blanks in the most generous way possible. That assumption no longer holds. This new release doesn't re-explain Diddy's rise. It doesn't restate allegations. It doesn't retrace the investigation step by step. It assumes you already know all of that. Instead, it takes the material that once felt like background and treats it as foreground. And that changes how everything feels. Moments that once seemed incidental now feel deliberate. Comments that sounded casual now land differently. Silences that felt temporary now feel permanent. One of the most striking shifts is how the documentary reframes timing. Not dates on a screen, but timing and behavior. When statements were made, when responses stopped, when conversations were allowed to fade instead of being finished. The film doesn't say this is intentional. It doesn't need to. It just shows you how often the same pattern appears. A moment surfaces, attention builds, a measured response follows. Then time steps in. For a long time, that pattern worked. Time softened edges, distance diluted urgency. Stories lost momentum. But Part 2 collapses that distance. It places moments that were once years apart right next to each other. When you see them back to back, they stop feeling isolated. They start feeling connected. And connection is where discomfort begins. This is also where the absence of certain voices becomes impossible to ignore. People who once spoke freely now seem careful. Others are missing entirely. The documentary doesn't call this out. It doesn't speculate. It simply lets absence sit in the frame long enough for it to be felt. Absence, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling like positioning. The film also shifts its focus away from public-facing moments. Instead of award shows and press appearances, attention drifts toward what happens when the cameras were supposed to be off. After parties, private conversations, planning stages, spaces where people speak differently because they believe context will protect them. When those moments are shown without commentary, they do something more powerful than accusation ever could. They invite comparison, not just between people, but between eras, between what was said then and what isn't being said now. This is where the emotional tone deepens. The first documentary carried urgency. This one carries weight. It feels colder, more restrained, almost settled, as if the story has moved past the phase where shock matters and entered the phase where consequences begin to form quietly. That's when reputations stop reacting and start calcifying, because outrage burns fast, records don't. Another thing becomes clear as this section unfolds. Despite the implications, there hasn't been a wave of aggressive pushback. No loud attempts to shut it down, no immediate legal storm, just carefully worded statements insisting narratives are being twisted. That response raises its own question. If nothing here holds weight, why is it being handled so cautiously? Why not address it fully? Why allow implication to linger instead of closing the loop? The documentary doesn't answer that. It doesn't need to. By now, the viewing experience has changed. You're no longer watching to see what happens next. You're watching to see how things are handled now that the room feels different. That awareness alone alters the balance. Reactions become more important than revelations. Tone matters more than content. Silence carries more meaning than statements. And once the audience starts watching this way, the story can't return to what it was. This isn't about new information. It's about unfinished information refusing to stay quiet. What part two does, quietly and deliberately, is remove the comfort of resolution. It takes what once felt complete and shows how much of it was left open. And when stories are left open long enough, they don't fade. They wait. By this point, something subtle has already shifted in the way the story feels. You're no longer being guided. You're being trusted. Trusted to remember what you saw before. Trusted to recognize patterns without them being named. Trusted to feel the weight of what's missing just as much as what's shown. And that trust is intentional, because once a viewer starts connecting dots on their own, the experience changes. It stops being content and starts becoming record. And records don't disappear when attention moves on. This is where part two becomes more unsettling than anything that came before. Not because it introduces explosive new material, but because it refuses to let old material stay isolated. Moments that were once spread across years are compressed into a single flow. When you see them like that, explanations that once felt sufficient suddenly feel incomplete. You start noticing how often answers stop just short of clarity, how frequently statements acknowledge concern without locating responsibility, how often timelines blur right when specificity would matter most. Nothing here feels rushed, and that's not accidental. Rushing invites mistakes. Patience invites observation. The documentary slows down even further, allowing silences to stretch just long enough for you to notice who seems comfortable inside them and who doesn't. That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Some voices remain broad, general, abstract. Others choose distance altogether, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying anything creates a reference point. And reference points are dangerous when the past is being reassembled instead of forgotten. What begins to emerge is not a story about a single moment, but about method, a consistent way of handling pressure. Let something surface briefly. Let it generate noise. Issue a controlled response. Then wait. Waiting has always been the safest strategy. Time dulls urgency. Distance softens memory. For a long time that worked, but part two quietly demonstrates that time isn't blurring anything anymore. Instead, it's stacking. Old interviews replayed now feel different. Statements that once sounded confident feel carefully framed. Not false, just selective. Selection is a form of control. This is where the audience's role changes again. You're no longer watching to be informed. You're watching to verify. Every new moment is measured against what you already remember. Every pause is compared. Every decision not to engage becomes part of the pattern. And patterns don't need to shout to be convincing. The documentary leans into repetition, not by replaying the same clips, but by showing the same behaviors across different years. The same tone used in completely different situations. The same reliance on reputation to carry conversations that were never finished. Repetition like this doesn't feel dramatic. It feels procedural. And procedure suggests design. What's uncomfortable it is realizing how effective this approach has been for so long. Not because anyone was tricked, but because the system didn't need to trick anyone. It only needed to slow things down. Let discomfort dissolve naturally. Let memory fragment. Let attention drift. This chapter exposes how silence wasn't passive. It was active, timed, placed, appearing exactly when clarity would have forced alignment between moments that were better kept separate. You start noticing how often explanations pivot away from timelines, how accountability is acknowledged in theory, then redirected in practice. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling like habit. The documentary doesn't accuse. It doesn't escalate. It simply refuses to let moments exist alone anymore. It stacks them, compresses time, removes the gaps where forgetting used to live. Once those gaps are gone, the story feels heavier without becoming louder. This is the point where the tension stops coming from what's being revealed and starts coming from what's being measured. Reactions, adjustments, language, distance, silence. Silence at this stage stops feeling like restraint. It starts feeling like choice. And once the audience recognizes that, the balance quietly shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at the center of it. It belongs to memory, to comparison, to context. Nothing explosive happens here, and that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out. Patterns don't. Patterns settle in, they stay. They don't ask to be believed. They simply repeat until recognition becomes unavoidable. By the end of this stretch, one thing is clear without ever being stated. This story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's being sustained by unresolved history. And unresolved history doesn't fade when people stop talking about it. It waits. By now, the tension isn't coming from revelation. It's coming from recognition. You've seen this before, just not like this. What the documentary does next is quietly widen the frame. It stops centering on individual moments and starts examining how those moments were allowed to repeat without consequence. Not loudly, not aggressively, methodically. The focus shifts from what happened to how it was handled, from actions to responses, from events to systems. And once you start watching that way, everything lands differently. Statements that once felt confident now feel calibrated. Interviews that once felt transparent now feel selective. Silences that once felt temporary now feel strategic. The film doesn't suggest deception. It highlights separation. Public confidence versus private restraint. What's said on record versus what's handled off camera. Moments where engagement would have clarified things, and the deliberate choice not to engage instead. That choice keeps showing up. A controversy surfaces. A tension spikes. A response appears. Brief, careful, incomplete. Then time steps in and quietly does the rest. Time becomes the cleanup crew. For years, this pattern blended into the background because it felt familiar, almost normal. Silence was interpreted as dignity. Distance was mistaken for maturity. Unanswered questions were labeled old news simply because enough time had passed. But time doesn't resolve stories. It spaces them out. By collapsing those spaces, the documentary removes the illusion of resolution. Pauses that once felt natural now feel intentional. Answers that once sounded complete now feel carefully framed. The effect isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. And accumulation is dangerous because it doesn't fade when attention moves on. Another shift becomes clear here. The language stays consistent even as circumstances change. The phrasing avoids absolutes. The tone remains measured. Nothing false is said, but nothing complete is said either. Incompleteness stops feeling like an oversight and starts feeling like a feature. because complete stories demand follow-up. Incomplete ones invite patience, and patience favors those who already hold influence. The documentary leans into this without ever spelling it out. It shows how accountability is acknowledged abstractly, then redirected in practice. How concern is expressed broadly while specifics remain just out of reach. Responsibility is discussed, but never anchored. This isn't presented as proof of wrongdoing. It's presented as evidence of method, a method built over years, refined through experience, protected by reputation. What makes this part especially unsettling is how familiar the pattern feels once it's visible. Not just here, but across the industry. You start realizing how often stories survive not by being disproven, but by being outlasted. How frequently attention is allowed to burn itself out before coherence is required. And once that realization lands, old material doesn't sound the same anymore. Past confidence feels rehearsed. Distance feels deliberate. Silence feels purposeful. This is where the story becomes heavier, not louder. Heavier. The weight comes from how predictable the responses become once you understand the structure. The pauses appear at the same points. The language softens around the same topics. Clarity is always just postponed enough to avoid alignment. The audience stops reacting emotionally and starts observing structurally. Instead of asking, is this true? The question becomes, why I refer you, which does the response always look the same? That shift is subtle but irreversible. The documentary doesn't chase drama here. It slows down. It lets silence stretch long enough to notice who seems comfortable inside it and who doesn't. Some voices remain broad, others retreat into generalities. Not because they have nothing to say, but because specificity creates reference points. And reference points invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. This is where silence stops being neutral. It becomes a signal that certain explanations would create more clarity than comfort, a signal that some conversations are riskier to finish than to avoid, a signal that distance still feels safer than alignment. Nothing explosive happens here, and that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out, patterns endure. By the end of this stretch, the viewer understands something quietly powerful. This story is no longer being carried by new information. It's being carried by what was never fully addressed. And once the audience starts measuring absence instead of reacting to presence, the pressure changes shape. It doesn't shout, it pulls. And that pull doesn't let go easily. This is where everything quietly turns. Up to this point, the documentary has been asking you to observe. Now it asks you to confront something harder. Not what happened, but how long it was allowed to keep happening the same way. The shift is subtle, but once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. Instead of presenting moments as isolated incidents, the film starts aligning outcomes. Not dramatically, surgically. A conversation from years ago placed next to a decision made much later. A casual remark paired with a pattern that repeats long after the context supposedly changed. Nothing is explained, nothing is underlined. The sequencing does all the work. And suddenly, coincidence starts losing its cover. This is the moment where the story stops feeling reactive and starts feeling cumulative, where you realize you're no longer watching a timeline, you're watching continuity. Behaviors learned early, responses refined over time, strategies that didn't disappear as influence grew, but scaled with it. That realization hits harder than any accusation ever could. Because if patterns persist across decades, across circumstances, across levels of power, then the question isn't whether something went wrong once. The question becomes whether the system was ever designed to correct itself at all. This is where the documentary leans into its most uncomfortable idea without ever stating it outright, that some environments don't just tolerate certain behaviors, they normalize them. That what looks shocking from the outside can feel routine on the inside when it's learned early and reinforced often. The film doesn't claim this. It shows proximity. Early anecdotes placed beside later outcomes. Old interviews replayed next to modern silence. Confidence that never fully wavers, even as situations escalate. And once those pieces sit together long enough, something clicks. You stop asking how someone avoided consequences in one moment. You start asking how consequences were consistently redirected. This is where the idea of control changes shape. It's no longer about dominance in the room, it's about insulation, about layers, about making sure pressure never lands where it hurts most. Not by denying reality, but by managing how it's experienced. The documentary revisits moments that once felt tragic but distant, events that were treated as unfortunate chapters, sealed off from the rest of the story. Now they're placed back into the timeline, not to accuse, but to recontextualize, to ask whether those moments were exceptions or signals. And that question lingers. What's striking is how little resistance this framing meets. Not publicly, not loudly. There's no explosive counter-narrative, just restraint, careful language, minimal engagement. And at this stage, restraint doesn't read as confidence anymore. It reads as calculation. Because challenging opinions is easy, challenging sequences is harder. Challenging patterns is hardest of all. Once viewers start seeing continuity instead of case, the story becomes harder to deflect. You can argue facts, you can dispute interpretations, but it's much harder to explain why the same types of outcomes keep emerging under different circumstances if nothing connects them. This is the turning point where the audience stops asking for proof and starts asking for explanation. Not an explanation of one moment, but of the structure that allowed many moments to resolve the same way. Why accountability always feels close but never fully lands. Why responsibility seems to disperse just before it needs to settle somewhere. And this is where silence becomes the loudest element in the room. Not because it hides something specific, but because it avoids something systemic. The documentary doesn't rush through this realization. It slows down. It gives you time to sit with it, time to replay what you've already seen, time to notice how often influence shows up not to end problems, but to redirect them. How often proximity to power changes outcomes without changing narratives. By the end of this stretch, the story feels fundamentally different. You're no longer watching a rise, a fall, or even a reckoning. You're watching a mechanism that doesn't depend on one decision, or one person, or one scandal. It depends on consistency. And once you recognize the mechanism, you understand why this chapter exists at all. Not to shock, not to accuse, but to remove the last layer of plausible isolation. Because when moments are no longer allowed to stand alone, the story stops being about what happened. It becomes about why it kept happening. And that question doesn't fade. After that realization settles in, the story doesn't rush forward. It watches. This is where the documentary becomes less interested in moments and more focused on reactions. Not what's revealed, but what follows. Who adjusts, who distances themselves, who continues speaking as if nothing has changed, and who suddenly finds silence more useful than explanation. Because once patterns are visible, reactions matter more than revelations. You start noticing how language shifts when pressure increases quietly instead of publicly. Statements become shorter, words become softer, specifics dissolve into generalities. Nothing is denied outright. Nothing is confirmed either. The space in between becomes the strategy. This isn't chaos, it's control. The film shows how power doesn't collapse when questioned. It adapts, it slows down, it gets quieter. Because silence buys time, and time has always been the safest place for unfinished stories to hide. But something is different now. Time isn't erasing anything, it's stacking it. Every old clip that resurfaces carries new weight. Interviews you've seen before now feel altered, not because they changed, but because context did. Confidence that once felt natural now feels rehearsed. Distance that once felt reasonable now feels deliberate, and deliberate choices invite scrutiny. This section leans heavily into contrast. Public unity versus private hesitation. Loyalty displayed loudly while accountability remains abstract. Moments when engagement could have clarified everything, and the consistent choice not to engage instead. The documentary doesn't frame this as wrongdoing. It frames it as design. A design built to manage attention, not truth, to survive cycles, not resolve them. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. If you don't create new material, old material stays unresolved instead of contradicted. That unresolved space is where influence prefers to operate. What becomes unsettling is how familiar this structure feels once it's visible. You realize this isn't unique to one story. It's a blueprint used wherever power and patience intersect. Let attention peak. Let it cool. Let time do what denial never could. For years it worked, but now the audience isn't reacting emotionally anymore. They're observing structurally, measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring how quickly narratives adjust when pressure rises just enough to be felt, but not enough to explode. This is where silence stops feeling neutral. It becomes data. Every pause is noticed, every absence is logged, every non-response adds pressure instead of releasing it. And pressure doesn't need noise to work. It just needs consistency. The documentary slows further, allowing the viewer to sit inside that realization, that the story no longer needs new footage to stay alive. It's feeding on what already exists and on what still hasn't been addressed. That's when gravity takes over. Gravity doesn't rush, it pulls. You feel it in the pacing, in how scenes linger, in how nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels heavier. Because once the audience starts comparing instead of consuming, the balance shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at the center of it. It belongs to memory, to context, to pattern. And patterns don't disappear when attention moves on. They wait, they repeat, they surface again when conditions are right. By the end of this stretch, the viewer isn't asking what's going to be revealed next. They're watching behavior under observation, watching how people move when they know the room is different now. That's a kind of pressure that doesn't burn out. It accumulates. And once accumulation replaces outrage, the story stops being temporary. By the time this final stretch unfolds, the story no longer feels like something that's being released. It feels like something that's been uncovered. The documentary stops chasing moments altogether and pulls the camera back. What you're left with isn't a sequence of events, but an ecosystem. Friends who stayed silent, businesses that kept moving forward, media narratives that softened edges instead of sharpening questions, structures that remained intact no matter how many storms passed through. And that's when the realization lands, this was never just about protecting an image. It was about preserving a system. As pressure increased over the years, nothing collapsed outwardly. It adapted. When criticism surfaced, it was reframed. When accusations grew louder, attention was redirected. When legal scrutiny appeared, layers were added, not to erase what happened, but to manage how it was remembered. The documentary quietly highlights something most people missed in real time, how moments of crisis were often followed by strategic visibility, appearances, statements, carefully timed interviews, content designed to remind the public who someone was supposed to be, not who people were beginning to question. And when family entered the frame, that strategy intensified. Unity became proof. Loyalty became a shield. Any criticism was framed as an attack rather than an inquiry. Slowly, the conversation shifted away from accountability and toward defense. And defenses work, as long as the premise is accepted. What's different now is that the premise itself is being examined. The film never claims one person caused everything. Instead, it presents a far more unsettling idea. That influence, when left unchecked, creates continuity. That environments shape behavior. That power learned early doesn't disappear with success, it scales with it. That's why this story doesn't end with fame, scandal, or even consequence. It circles back to beginnings, to how norms are established, to how boundaries are taught or blurred, to how silence is modeled long before it's ever used strategically. As the final moments unfold, the past keeps resurfacing. Old interviews replayed with new understanding. Casual jokes heard plainly without the insulation of context. Moments once celebrated now carrying undertones that are impossible to ignore. It's not about rewriting history. It's about finally reading it without distraction. This is also where the tension reaches its quiet peak. Cease and desist letters, public denials, claims of defamation. all appearing not when the first documentary aired, but when word began spreading about what was coming next. Timing matters because it suggests awareness. It suggests concern. It suggests that this material touches something more sensitive than anything released before. That's why people are watching now. Not just fans, not just critics, institutions, platforms, corporate partners. Everyone who once stood comfortably nearby is reassessing proximity. Because once a narrative tips, it doesn't ask permission. In the closing moments, the story returns to the present, to where things stand now, to new projects, new documentaries, new attempts to reclaim control of the narrative. But the contrast is unavoidable. On one side, a polished message of resilience and misunderstanding. On the other, years of footage, testimony, and patterns that refuse to stay isolated. And the viewer is left with a choice, not about guilt or innocence, but about belief. Do you believe the version being sold now, or the one that emerges when everything is laid side by side? Because the most powerful takeaway isn't outrage, it's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence is inherited quietly, and how truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks, piece by piece, until ignoring it becomes harder than facing it. That's why this story doesn't end with a documentary. It enters a new phase, one where every past decision, every relationship, every moment of silence is reevaluated under a brighter light. And once that light is on, it doesn't turn off easily. This was never about one man. It was about how power is built, maintained, and eventually questioned. And now that the questions are being asked steadily instead of loudly, the answers can't hide behind time anymore.